The title of my sermon today is on marrying your son's murderer. I once knew two men in Connecticut who had sons murdered within 4 years of each other. Because both men were ministers, their words and actions in response to the murders were somewhat public and watched very carefully by the members of the congregations and the community. After all, aren't Christian ministers supposed to model the life and the work of Jesus in their own lives? The eyes of everyone familiar with their stories were upon them. How would they respond? Well, they each took a completely different tact with completely different outcomes. First, Reverend Stuart Brush's story. In December of 1983, 21-year-old Dean Brush was delivering pizza in a not-so-savory neighborhood of Bridgeport, Connecticut. 3 teenagers hitched a ride with him. One of them pulled out a gun, and when Dean tried to take the gun away, he was shot multiple times and left dead on the sidewalk. The police came to Dean's home in Reading to tell his mother, Laura, and adoptive father, Reverend Stuart Brush, who was just back from 3 months in alcohol rehab, that their son had been killed. The Brush family reeled with grief, anger, and pain. Laura had been a single parent for 6 years before marrying Stuart, and her younger son, John, looked up to Dean as a father figure. After Dean's death, John fell in and out of drug and alcohol abuse and ultimately hanged himself in 1991. Laura's daughter, Amy, struggled with substance abuse as well, but after 4 attempts at rehab, she became sober and got on with her life. The Brushes watched angrily as Dean's killer was released after only 6 years of his 38-year sentence was served. Stuart and Laura chose to deal with their anger and grief through a support group, and Stuart became active as a vocal advocate for the death penalty. In Stuart's words, "Our son was one of those people who received the death penalty from those 3 boys. If we're not going to give them that judgment as well, then Dean's life was less than capital importance, and I don't buy that. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth." As of April 11, 2011, Stuart was still campaigning to keep the death penalty in Connecticut, in contrast to more than 300 Christian and Jewish leaders who supported a bill to replace the death penalty with life in prison. The 300 clergy asserted that human life is sacred and the money spent to impose the death penalty would be greater spent preventing crime. Capital punishment was repealed in Connecticut in 2012. And the last time I encountered Reverend Stuart Brush, he was still very bitter and very angry. And now Reverend Walt Everett's story. In 1987, Walt's adopted son, Scott, was shot and killed at the age of 24 by a very troubled 27-year-old, Mike Carlucci. Mike had been up, as best as he could remember, 4 nights in a row, shooting coke and taking Percodans by the dozen. His arms were a network of needle injections. He saw people in closets who weren't there and would run to the roof in his stocking feet to chase boogeymen with a .38. That night, in the summer of 1987, after guzzling a couple rounds of tequila, Carlucci heard a scream. Grabbing a gun, he opened his door and heard the woman next door crying for help. She said she'd been attacked and pointed down the hall to the door that led to the stairwell. Someone on the landing was banging on the door with his fists, yelling to be let in. Carlucci went down the hall, opened the door, aimed his pistol at a tall, thin man he didn't know, and shot him dead. What Mike didn't know was that this was Scott Everett, a neighbor in the building who was pounding on the door because he'd locked himself out. For almost a year after Scott's murder, Reverend Walt Everett's emotional state moved from rage to depression. Walt was the pastor of our small Methodist congregation, and he did the best he could to serve as pastor, but he often broke into tears during the service. It was very hard. Almost a year to the day after Scott was killed, he attended the sentencing of Mike Carlucci. It was the first time Walt had ever seen Carlucci. Mike was 4 hours late to the hearing because he had spent the last morning of his freedom smoking crack in his father's basement. In the courtroom, Walt was given the opportunity to address Mike and the harm he had caused the Everett family. It wasn't until Walt faced him and described in chilling detail the suffering that the murder had caused his loved ones that Mike stood and apologized with a simple, "I'm sorry." Though Walt's friends in the court summarily dismissed his statement, Walt heard something that rang authentic and true in Carlucci's brief statement of remorse. Short as the apology was, it had a profound effect on Walt. His rage and hurt leveled off, and for the first time in a year, he could think straight. After the hearing, Walt wrote Mike a letter with the intent of settling matters for good. After again citing the damaging consequences of Mike's actions, this time in writing, Walt's personal anguish, the shattered family, he closed the letter with the words he'd been deliberating over for days. "I forgive you, Mike." 3 weeks later, Carlucci replied, voicing his profound regret and his gratitude for Walt's grace. A correspondence started, and then visits began, and then a friendship developed, further ensuring the demise of Walt's marriage to Izzy, who was not happy with Walt's reconciliatory actions. In February of 1991, 3 years after his son was murdered, Everett went before a parole board to advocate for Mike's release. That June, Carlucci was awarded early release after just 35 months in jail and went to work for a trucking firm where his boss described him as the best supervisor I ever had. Walt and Mike began speaking together at universities, churches, and community groups about the healing power of forgiveness, healing both for the forgiver and the forgiven. Walt became an ardent advocate for the anti-death penalty and restorative justice organizations. In 1995, with TV cameras locked on Walt and Mike, Reverend Walt Everett presided over the wedding of Mike and Sandy Carlucci in a Bridgeport, Connecticut Methodist church. Walt married his son's murderer. Walt was and is an amazing person. In 2004 interview by Paul Salteroff of the Rolling Stone magazine, Mike Carlucci was asked, "If someone came along and killed your daughter, do you think you'd be able to forgive him?" Mike responded, "I don't know. I don't understand how Walt was able to, and I was suspicious in the beginning, but he kept showing up as a genuine person, and he's been there every minute, steady and constant. And meanwhile, I killed his son, but yet he saved my life. How many people would do that?" It's one thing after being grievously wronged to not seek vengeance against a murderer, and instead to forgive and to be at peace. We have all been hurt by the actions of other people and know how wasteful anger and revenge can be. It's quite another thing to completely forgive another person, bridge the gap, and help the person who harmed us heal, embracing that person's full humanity as a person of inherent worth and dignity. Kate Lowenstein, a national organizer, social worker, and lawyer, was the daughter of late Allard Lowenstein, a much-beloved New York congressman, who was shot 5 times at point-blank range by a psychotic ex-student of his in 1980. Lowenstein notes, "Survivors largely fall into 2 types. There are people who present themselves as being lifelong victims and carry their murder as a badge of honor, nursing their rage and grievance, like Reverend Brush. And then there are those who are distilled by the loss, forced by the heat and pressure it wields to become richer, deeper versions of who they are, like Reverend Brush, like Reverend Everett. If you're the kind of person who carries a grudge, then the murder just proves your point. But if you're open to all the world out there, then the killing becomes a conduit, a thing that makes you stronger and more engaged." There's an inspiring website called forgivenessproject.com that speaks to the possibilities and the power of forgiveness through a multitude of stories. One such story is of 20-year-old Laramie Bird, who was murdered by OSHA Israel on February 12, 1993. Laramie was Mary Johnson's only son. Her anger and rage and hate became all-consuming. After the trial, she received the poem 2 Mothers that was read earlier, To Mary, it was a healing poem about the commonality of pain and showed her a path to healing. She felt moved by the poem's compassion to visit her son's murderer, Osha, in prison. Mary started the conversation with Osha by saying, "I don't know you, and you don't know me. My son didn't know you, and you didn't know my son. So let's start from square one. I want to know you." At the end of their session, Osha asked if he could hug her, and she said yes. As he began to hug her, she started to fall, and he held her up. With that human touch, bonding began to take place. Mary remembers that as she hugged the man who murdered her son, she felt all the hatred, bitterness, animosity, and anger leave her body. In March 2010, Osha was released, and Mary threw him a welcome home party. When Osha was asked about his side of the story regarding the relationship with Mary, he recalls a process of gradual maturing. He grew into having a better understanding of himself and what his triggers were. Through Mary, he learned and recounts. When people hurt us or cause us some kind of pain or makes us feel a certain type of way and we carry it, then more things happen and more things feed that pain, and any time you feed something, it grows. If you continue to hold on to the pain, it grows. If you learn to let it go and forgive whoever done something or said something to you, you starve that pain, and any time you starve something, it dies. So forgiveness is pretty much saying, I give up holding on. Forgiveness is always possible because it is an act generated by an individual, you, and the rewards are reaped by that same individual, you. You do not have to have another person involved to forgive. Forgiveness is the single most radical action a person can take to foster wholeness, healing, peace, joy, and love in one's life. Forgiveness is not pardoning, excusing, forgetting, denying, or condoning a righteous act, denying anger, hurt, rage, and pain. Forgiveness is a choice or a decision, a letting go of anger and pain, an act of courage and transcendence. It is a way of life. Not forgiving yourself or someone else only hurts you. The heart of the teaching and practice of A Course in Miracles is a process and experience of forgiveness. Forgiveness is the path to your own healing. It is a means by which the experience of separation from God and perceived others is undone. Forgiveness bridges the gap between the ego self we believe we are and our real self, the self that God created. As we're willing to offer forgiveness to another, to see past our own illusions and his illusions of separateness, we see past the mask of the ego to the divine spark of light that is the truth in him and ourselves. Forgiveness reveals to us that we are still God's daughters and sons, no matter what the ego has taught us about ourselves. Each time we forgive, we are a step closer to home. Every step we take is upheld and strengthened by the power of God and by the efforts of all who take the journey with us. In the Two Mothers poem, we found two mothers who deeply loved their sons, bound together in the grief of their sons' deaths, in spite of the one son perhaps being the cause of the other one's death. Like the two mothers, we are at our core the same. Walter Everett recognized this when he chose to see his son's murderer as a human being, who too was suffering, but for different reasons. Mary chose to embrace Osha, her son's murderer, and they healed from the murder together. If people like Walt and Mary can forgive their sons' murderers, shouldn't we be able to forgive far less grievous offenses? We share the same joys, concerns, suffering, and grief. We are not far apart from each other at all. It's no wonder that our yawns and our smiles, laughter, and tears are contagious. We know each other's joys, each other's pain. Underneath all our differences, we share the same humanity, the same being. When we connect from these more essential aspects of ourselves, we connect with all people. May we all see each other through the eyes of each other's mothers and fathers and God, unconditionally loved. Amen, and so be it.